So let me introduce our first invited speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jed Pizarro-Guevara. Jed received his PhD from UC Santa Cruz in 2020. His dissertation, entitled When Human Universal Meets Language Specific, applies rigorous psycholinguistic methods to evaluate how Tagalog fits within current theories of processing and comprehension of filler gap dependencies, such as relative clauses, as well as what new insights the language can give us regarding such theories. Jed's broader work continues this thread of inquiry by applying these methods to the study of languages historically underrepresented in psycholinguistics. These include Davao Bisaya, which Jed is a speaker of, along with Tagalog, as well as Santiago La Chopa Zapotec. Jed is now a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, working in Brian Dillon's lab. And in collaboration with the lab, Jed is continuing his work on Tagalog, but branching out into the realm of reflexives, which I am personally very thankful for. So it is my pleasure to invite Jed to share his new work with us. The title of his talk is What Tagalog Can Teach Us, the Influence of Word Order in Reflexive Processing.
So thanks for the introduction, Henderson. And here I was expecting a quote by Regina George from Mean Girls, but alas. Okay, so hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for coming. So today I'm going to talk about what Tagalog can teach us in the domain of reflexive processing. So let's dive right in. So we've learned a great deal about incremental sentence processing over the last 40 years or so. So for example, we've learned that comprehenders use a queue-based retrieval mechanism to form linguistic dependencies in real time. So we see this in the domain of reflexive processing, for example. So the basic idea is that upon encountering a reflexive like herself, comprehenders launch a retrieval operation to look for an element in working memory that best matches the cues that's instantiated by the reflexive. So simplifying a bit for now, let's just say that the cues are its number and gender features. So an element that's feminine and singular. Zooming out a bit, this finding is really a claim about how working memory works. So if humans share the same cognitive architecture, then we should expect that this claim would leave some footprint in all human languages when we look at their behavioral data. Unfortunately, much of what we know about language processing suffers from a lack of linguistic diversity. So the data have come mostly from language users who are what's called weird in the social sciences. So Western, there's a qualification there, and some East Asian, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And just to give us an estimate of the weird centricity of the field, let's consider the figure on the right from Anand, Chung, and Wagers 2011. So what they did was that they surveyed journal articles and conference abstracts and found that about 85% of the language experiments come from only 10 languages. And English is disproportionately represented, accounting for about a third of these studies. So, if you're skeptic Steve, you might ask, well, to what extent is the knowledge that we have right now a general theory of language processing? And to what extent is this artifactual? Because we've only looked at a very limited sample of the world's languages. So just to make it very explicit, I'm not discounting the progress that we've made as a field because we've focused on weird languages. I think there are very practical reasons for doing so. What I'm saying is we know a lot more now, and I think technology really has opened up, new and exciting ways for us to be collecting behavioral data. So I think we are in a good place where we can start addressing this potential concern of undersampling. So today, I'll talk about a project that I'm working on with Brian Dillon to ask the question of how different word order properties of a language can affect or change what we know about how linguistic dependencies are processed. And I'll be using reflexive processing in Tagalog as a case study. So just to preview the results, after controlling for a potential confound in the literature, Tagalog comprehenders exhibited interference effects that are consistent with a cue-based mechanism. There are some wrinkles, however, and we'll talk about those wrinkles today. So I think this finding is exciting because it's expected given what we already know. It becomes even more exciting because we're replicating, the finding in a language that's virtually absent in the psycholinguistics literature. So I think, this gives us more reason to believe that maybe cue-based retrieval is a universal feature of how human languages are processed. So here's the roadmap for today's talk. So first, I want to give a brief overview of what cue-based retrieval is and introduce terminologies that I'll be using throughout. And then we'll zoom in and talk about reflexive processing. And then we'll talk about the self-paced reading experiment that leverages Tagalog word order to address a potential confound in the literature. Then we'll talk about the implications of the results. And lastly, we'll talk about some related experiments that are in the pipeline. So one of the central questions that psycholinguists have focused on is how we comprehend linguistic dependencies in real time. That is, as a sentence unfolds over time. So I think a widely accepted view is that we use a cue-based retrieval mechanism to form linguistic dependencies in real time. So under this model, when we encounter a dependency that needs to be resolved, we use certain features of the element that instantiated the dependency to look for another element in working memory that could resolve it. And to make this more concrete, let's consider the sentence in one. So the bodybuilder who the personal trainers worked with was competitive for the gold medal. So upon encountering the verb was, a comprehender knows that she has to resolve subject-verb agreement. So she uses the features of the verb was. As a quick aside, I should point out that the set of features that comprehenders attend to and use in real time, that's an area of active research. So for this toy example, let's just say that the verb wants something singular, abbreviated here as SG, and a clausemate subject, which I abbreviated here as CMS. And the comprehender, she uses these features to search for the codependent element in working memory. So she finds the bodybuilder because it perfectly matches the features needed by the verb. And so the dependency is resolved. So just to go over some terminologies that I'll be using throughout. So the process of looking for the element to resolve the dependency, that's called retrieval. The features that launched the retrieval operation, that's called retrieval cues. So that's the singular and CMS on the verb was for this particular example. So the element that resolves the dependency, so the full match with the retrieval cues, that's called the retrieval target or simply the target, and that's the bodybuilder for this particular example. And the other elements in working memory that could potentially resolve the dependency because they're of the right category, they're called distractors. So this is the personal trainers for this particular example. So retrieval is fast and associative, and this allows comprehenders to form linguistic dependencies rapidly enough to support real-time comprehension. However, one of the disadvantages, so to speak, is that it's subject to what's called similarity-based interference. This happens when the distractor or distractors, if there's more than one of them, matches and features with the target. And there are two flavors of interference. Following Dillon 2011, let's refer to them as inhibitory interference and facilitatory interference. In the next couple of slides, we'll talk about when and how they arise, but just to preview how they manifest behaviorally in reading time studies. For inhibitory interference, we see a slowdown at the retrieval site. So this is for the toy example that we just talked about, this was at the verb was, or a couple of words downstream, depending on the type of reading experiment that you're conducting. And for facilitatory interference, we see a speed up. So now let's talk about inhibitory interference in greater detail and see when this arises. So consider sentence 1 again, repeated here as 2. So the bodybuilder who the personal trainers worked with was competitive for the gold medal. So here, the target's features, so this is the bodybuilder, it completely matched the retrieval cues. On the other hand, the distractor's features didn't match any of the retrieval cues. So this serves as our baseline. This is when both elements are, different for retrieval purposes. So now let's consider sentence 3, which is minimally different. So now the distractor is singular. So again, the target's features completely match the retrieval cues. This time around, the distractor's features partially match the retrieval cues. More specifically, they match in number. So this partial match causes a slowdown at the verb and or spillover regions, again, depending on the type of reading study that you're conducting. This slowdown is often attributed to the spreading of activation. You're spreading it around because there are partial matches. So on average, it will take longer to retrieve the correct element, so the target. Now let's talk about facilitatory interference. So in 4, we have an ungrammatical sentence. The bodybuilder who the personal trainer worked with were competitive for the gold medal. As we can see, the target only partially matches the retrieval cues of the verb. I mean, well, it's ungrammatical after all. So crucially for us, the distractor doesn't match any of the retrieval cues. So this serves as a baseline for how ungrammatical sentences are read. In 5, we have a minimally different example where the distractor is now plural. Again, the target only partially matches the retrieval cues of the verb. This time around, the distractor also partially matches the retrieval cues. So these partial matches cause a speed up at the verb or at the retrieval site. Since there's no item that's a complete match with the retrieval cues, all partial matches are considered for retrieval. And since there are 2 partial matches, retrieval of any of the 2 items will finish faster on average because there's a higher probability that you'll be able to retrieve something. So the toy examples that we just talked about, those involve subject-verb dependencies. Cue-based retrieval is a general model of dependency formation. So it's also been used to account for reflexive antecedent dependencies. So the version of retrieval that we just talked about, let's refer to that as a simple model of retrieval to contrast with what we're going to talk about in this section, which is a syntactically guided model of retrieval. So here's a cue-based account for how reflexives are processed. Consider the sentence in 6. The bodybuilder who the personal trainers worked with injured himself on the lightest weights. So upon encountering the reflexive himself, a comprehender launches a cue-based retrieval operation that looks for a feature matching antecedent in working memory. So for the sake of exposition, let's just say that the reflexive wants something singular and something that is a C commanding subject, which I've abbreviated as CCOM. And the comprehender uses these retrieval cues to look for the antecedent in working memory. So she finds the bodybuilder because it's the item in memory that fully matches the retrieval cues of the reflexive. So some maintain that this retrieval operation at the reflexive is syntactically guided. The basic idea is that comprehenders are able to deploy principle A of the binding theory to limit the domain that she must search to find an antecedent. So when I say syntactically guided, when I say a syntactically guided account, what I really mean is that it's a class of proposals that somehow leverage structural cues over non-structural cues. So there's at least two ways that researchers have conceived of how principle A could be deployed in real time. So some scholars argue that it acts more like a categorical filter, where comprehenders don't consider any of any elements in working memory that are not structurally licensed. So this is a very strong version of this model. Others argue for a more intermediate position, where they say that structural cues are just weighted higher than non-structural cues. So syntactically guided retrieval has been advanced in the literature because of data points like 7 and 8. So 7 and 8, they involve ungrammatical sentences because, well, the target is singular and then the reflexive is plural. So in 7, the target only partially matches the retrieval cues, and it doesn't match any of the distractors. The features of the distractor doesn't match any of the retrieval cues. So this gives us a baseline of how ungrammatical reflexives are read. In 8, we have a minimally different example where the distractor is now plural. Again, the target only partially matches the retrieval cues of the verb, not the verb, the reflexive. And this time around, the distractor also partially matches the retrieval cues of the reflexive. So these configurations in 7 and 8, they look awfully like the ungrammatical subject-verb dependencies that we've talked about earlier. However, unlike subject-verb dependencies, many earlier researchers have found no evidence for facilitatory interference in reflexive antecedent dependencies. So that's why syntactically guided retrievals have been advanced. Though I want to explicitly flag that newer studies like Jaeger and colleagues 2020 have found weak interference effects. So now I want us to consider a world, an alternative to a syntactically guided retrieval. So where it's an account that doesn't need to assign special status to structural cues. And let's call this recent activation, and hopefully it will become clear as to why it's called this as we talk more about it. So the experimental items used in previous studies might have a potential confound. So the reflexive occurred immediately after the verb. Why does that matter? So this immediate post-verbal position could give the reflexive easy access to the antecedent via recent activation. So let's consider 9 to make this more concrete. So the bodybuilder who the personal trainer or trainers, doesn't matter which, worked with, injured himself or themselves. So the basic idea of this recent activation story is that upon encountering the matrix verb injured, comprehenders could be retrieving the matrix subject along with its features for thematic integration. That is to give it its theta role. So as an aside, there's independent evidence that retrieving something refreshes its activation. So because the reflexive is immediately after, the matrix subject, along with its features, so the singular and then plus C command, it could still be enjoying a high level of activation because it was recently retrieved for thematic integration purposes. So then upon encountering the reflexive, this high level of activation either ensures that it wins against the distractors and is the one that's retrieved, or it makes retrieval completely unnecessary because the comprehender can just quickly check the features of the target against the retrieval cues of the reflexive because you just retrieved it. So in either case, comprehenders would have easy access to the matrix subject with no need to rely on syntactically guided retrieval cues. So in other words, just by virtue of recent activation alone, we can get principle A-like effects. So there is some evidence in the literature that is consistent with this recent activation story. So in an eye tracking while reading experiment, King, Andrews, and Wagers found the following. So like the people who advance a syntactically guided model of retrieval, they found no evidence for interference when the reflexive is immediately post-verbal. Crucially, however, they found evidence for interference when there's more distance between the verb and the reflexive. And they compared sentences like 10 and 11. The crucial difference here is that in 10, the reflexive is immediately post-verbal, while in 11, there's some material in between the verb. So they leverage the fact that verbs like ship allows for double object constructions. I'd be more than happy to talk about their design in greater detail during Q&A, but that's the crucial contrast. So I know that was a lot of background information. So now let's switch gears and talk about the experiment. Before we talk about the actual experiment, though, let's just quickly talk about the basics of Tagalog reflexives. So there are three ways Tagalog reflexives can be formed, and it builds on the word sarili, which is the word for self. You can have it bear, though it kind of feels literary this way. The more common way to form reflexives is to attach pronouns to it, kind of like how you do regular possession. So if sarili is at the left edge, you attach a genitive pronoun after it. If sarili is at the right edge, you attach a data pronoun followed by a linker in the front. For the experiment that's to come, the items that we have use the third form. And in terms of their binding behavior, previous research has suggested that they need to be locally bound. Okay, so now let's talk about the rationale of the present study. So I take seriously the alternative interpretation, the whole recent activation story. And in this study, I want to control for it as much as possible. So I leverage the word order of Tagalog to really maximize the chances that the extent to which we observe principal A-like effects cannot just be reduced to recent activation of the matrix subject. So let's schematize what I mean by this. So in 12, I described the basic shape of the experimental items. We have a verb followed by a noun that will eventually be the target for the reflexive downstream. And then this noun is modified by an RC, and then we have a distractor inside the RC. And then we have a reflexive, and then the rest of the sentence. So the logic of this study here is that because the matrix subject, which is NP1 in 12, is immediately post-verbal. So upon encountering the subject, the verb can immediately discharge its data role to the subject. So the relative clause intervening between NP1 and the reflexive ensures that the matrix subject is given enough temporal distance to allow decay and activation. So whatever is going on at the reflexive, at the site of retrieval, it cannot be because the reflexive had easy access to the matrix subject via recent activation, because, well, it's not recently activated anymore. So in a sense, this configuration, I think, allows us to see a clearer picture of what the retrieval operation for reflexive processing looks like, because we're able to control for the potential recent activation confound. So having given a high-level overview of the rationale of the study, here are the research questions. So first, we wanted to see, to what extent do Tagalog comprehenders attend to the number feature of the target when interpreting reflexives? So this really is just a sanity check for us. This gives us an indication that comprehenders are, well, doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? That they're resolving reflexive antecedent dependencies. Second, we wanted to see the extent to which they attend to the number feature of the distractor when interpreting reflexives in real time. This question allows us to think about the role of principal A in real-time reflexive processing. So to answer these questions, we use a 2x2 design crossing grammaticality and match. And I'll explain what these two factors mean shortly. So recall that the basic shape of our sentences is as follows. First you have the matrix verb followed by a noun, which is going to be the target of the reflexive downstream. Then you have a linker to introduce an RC. And then the RC contains a distractor inside. And crucially, this noun cannot structurally license the upcoming reflexive. And then you have some adverb for padding, and then you encounter the reflexive, and then the rest of the sentence. So we manipulated grammaticality by varying whether the target and the reflexive matched in number features. So for our experiment, the reflexive was always plural. So the grammatical conditions will have a plural target noun, which is in yellow. The ungrammatical conditions will have a singular target noun, which is in blue. We also manipulated whether the distractor and the reflexive matched in number features. So in the match conditions, the distractor is plural. So this is this is the solid box. And in the mismatch conditions, the distractor is singular. So this is the one inside the dotted box. We created 24 items using this template and distributed them across 4 lists via Latin square. And we also included 56 fillers that didn't involve reflexives. So this is a self-paced reading experiment. So basically, words were presented one phrase at a time. Each phrase was center aligned, and they were presented non-cumulatively. Participants pressed the space bar to move to the next region, and the reading times were measured at each region. And after each item, participants were asked a comprehension question. More details on this in the upcoming slides, but right now I just want to give you a sense of what a trial in a self-paced reading experiment looks like in case you're not familiar with the methodology. So, if you're a participant, you see the first word, pinupuri, and then you press the space bar to see the next word. Then you keep doing that until you see the end of the sentence. And then you're confronted with a comprehension question, and that's one trial. As we saw, it was a self-paced reading experiment, and the experiment was deployed in IBEX. And after each item, there was a comprehension question. In the grammatical condition, we used a comprehension to probe the participant's interpretation of the reflexive. So this is what we just saw earlier. So an example would be sino ang pinupuri, who is being praised. In the ungrammatical condition, we used the comprehension question to ask about other parts of the sentence. So this was done, well, because there's no reflexive dependency that needs to be resolved because it's ungrammatical. And also it gives participants a reason to pay attention to other parts of the sentence and not just, the reflexive dependency, because we don't want them developing a task strategy. So we recruited 80 participants via Prolific, which is an online crowdsourcing platform. The participants range from 18 to 62 years of age. The mean age was 31. 64 of our participants identified as L1 Tagalog speakers, and then the rest were sequential bilinguals. So before any statistical analyses were conducted, we excluded 10 participants for 2 reasons. So the first reason is that if they didn't get at least 75% accuracy in the non-critical comprehension questions. So these are the questions that didn't probe their interpretation of the reflexive. And we also excluded participants for unnatural responses during debriefing. So after they've completed the experiment, we had a debriefing page. There we asked them to respond to the following question. Anong mga bagong hobbies at interes ang na-pick up nyo nang dahil sa pandemya? So, what hobbies and interests did you pick up due to the pandemic? I know, big mood, right? So we did this to make sure that there are actually people who are taking the experiment and not computer bots. because remember, this is an online crowdsourcing platform, and that they actually knew how to speak Tagalog, and they're not just posers who say that they speak Tagalog. Okay, so before we talk about the results, I want to talk about the predictions of a simple model of retrieval like the one implemented by Lewis and Vasisht, 2005, and pit that against a strong version of a syntactically guided model of retrieval like the one in Dillon et al. 2013. So these models sort of represent two ends of the spectrum of the various models of retrieval that we could possibly have for reflexive processing. So under a simple model of retrieval, we expect what we saw earlier in subject-verb dependencies. In grammatical conditions, we expect to see inhibition, that is, partial matches causing a slowdown. So that means that in grammatical conditions, on average, we're going to expect the match conditions to be slower than the mismatch conditions. Under a strong version of a syntactically guided model of retrieval, comprehenders don't really consider items in memory that aren't structurally licensed, so we don't expect any interference effects. In ungrammatical conditions, under a simple model of retrieval, again, we expect to see what we saw earlier in subject-verb dependencies. We expect to see facilitation, that is, partial matches causing a speed up. So that means that in the ungrammatical conditions, on average, we're going to expect match conditions being faster than mismatch conditions. And similarly as earlier, under a strong version of a syntactically guided model of retrieval, comprehenders don't consider items in memory that aren't structurally licensed, so we don't expect any interference effects. So before looking at their reading times, let's look at their responses to comprehension questions. So recall that we only asked their interpretation of the reflexive in the grammatical conditions. So here are the results of how they interpreted the reflexives. So remember that match meant that the distractor and the reflexive matched in features, meaning that they're both plural. Mismatch is when the distractor is singular. So when the reflexive and the distractor matched in number features, they chose the target 71% of the time. When the reflexive mismatched the distractor's number features, they got numerically better and chose the target 74% of the time. However, there's no evidence for that the number features of the distractor actually affected their accuracy. So, these results are consistent with principle A. So the number of the distractor had very little impact on how comprehenders ultimately interpreted the reflexive. But this doesn't give us any indication on whether they considered the distractor as the sentence was unfolding, because these are final state judgments. So for that, we would need to look at the reading times. So here's an overview of their reading times across the different regions. I'm not going to dwell on this too long because we will actually zoom in and look at what their behavior was in the critical region, so at the reflexive. So the orientation of this graph, it's slightly different from the bigger graph that I just showed you. So here on the x-axis, we now have whether it's grammatical or not. On the y-axis, we have the raw reading times at the critical region, so the reflexive. So there was clear evidence for ungrammatical sentences taking longer to read. The probability was 99%. We see this when we take the average of the points on the left side of the figure and compare that with the average of the points on the right side of the figure. This is a sanity check for us. What this means is that participants were doing what they were supposed to be doing, paying attention to the number features of the reflexive and the antecedent to resolve the dependency. There's also clear evidence for feature mismatching distractors. So that is when they're singular, taking longer to read than feature mismatching distractors, so when they're plural. So the probability is of this main effect of match is 98%. So this is actually a surprising result, and we'll talk more about this later. And crucially, there is some evidence for an interaction. There's clear evidence for a mismatch effect in the ungrammatical condition, meaning that the yellow point on the right is read faster than the blue point on the right. This is facilitatory interference, and the probability is 97%. There's mixed evidence for a mismatch effect in the grammatical condition as well, but the probability is only 80%. So in other words, just to take stock, sentences with feature matching distractors were read faster, especially in the ungrammatical conditions. In the interest of time, I am going to skip the next couple of slides. Pretty much the main point here is that the effects that we saw at the critical region, it persisted up to 2 regions downstream. So just to recap the results, I think there are 2 generalizations that can be made. So first, comprehenders are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They were paying attention to the number feature of the target. And we saw this in their reading times. So recall that there was a main effect of grammaticality at the reflexive, where the grammatical sentences were read faster than ungrammatical ones. We also saw this in their interpretation of the reflexive. In the grammatical sentence with feature mismatching distractors, they chose the target over the distractor 70% of the time. Again, this is a sanity check for us. Second, comprehenders also seem to be attending to the number features of the distractor. So we saw this in their reading times in one of 2 ways. So first, oops, JK. So first, when the sentence was ungrammatical, we observed facilitation when there's a feature matching distractor. In other words, there's facilitatory interference. Second, when the sentence was grammatical, we also saw facilitatory interference. So now let's talk about first generalization 2A. So this is the first bullet point. So the fact that we observed facilitatory interference in the ungrammatical conditions. So this is consistent with the prediction of a simple model of retrieval, much like what we saw in our toy example earlier concerning subject-verb dependencies. When there's no fully matching target, we expect partial matches to be faster to find because there's a higher probability of finding the target or the distractor because there's 2 of them. This is inconsistent, however, with a strong version of a syntactically guided model of retrieval, where we expect to not see any interference effects. And I'm going to claim that this finding actually suggests that the weak interference effects that we see in English, so the principal A-like effects that earlier studies have shown, that this could be a reflex of the language's word order. So, and this has been suggested by King, Andrews, and Wagers previously, so that maybe we're getting these weak interference effects in reflexive dependencies because the reflexive was immediately post-verbal. So why do I think this? Well, recall that this experiment was designed to control for recent activation of the matrix subject by leveraging the VSO word order of Tagalog. And we modified the subject with an RC to allow for a decay in the activation of the matrix subject. So by the time the comprehenders encounter the reflexive, it really is more about the retrieval process. And after controlling for recent activation, we did see interference effects, much like what King, Andrew, and Wagers found when there's more distance between the verb and the reflexive. Let's also talk about generalization 2B, which is actually an interesting finding. So the observation is that we saw facilitatory interference in the grammatical condition. This is surprising. It's actually inconsistent both with the prediction of a strong version of a syntactically guided model of retrieval, where again, we're expecting to not see any interference effects because you're not supposed to be paying attention to the things that aren't structurally licensed. And this is also inconsistent with a prediction of a simple model of retrieval without any qualifications. So recall that under a simple model of retrieval, we expect to see inhibitory interference, not facilitatory. So I would argue that this can actually be made consistent with a simple model of retrieval if we add something to it. So we're not changing the retrieval process per se. We're just adding something that happens before it. And this is something that we've already talked about, actually, recent activation. So for now, I'm just going to claim that interference effects in Tagalog could be a reflex of the language's word order. And I'll expand on what I mean by that and how this relates to recent activation in a slide or two. So here's an interim summary of what we just talked about. A smiley face with sunglasses emoji mean that the results are consistent with the predictions of that model. A crying emoji means that the results are inconsistent with the predictions of that model. And a pensive emoji, I think that's what you call it, means that the results are consistent, but we need to talk more about it. And talk about it we will in the next slide. So let's unpack what I meant by this. That interference effects in Tagalog could actually be a reflex of word order and see how it relates back to the recent activation story. So again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Recall that we leveraged Tagalog BSO word order, as we see in 13, to control for the recent activation of the matrix subject that's been, I guess, plaguing the experimental items in English. So we modified NP1, which is the target, with an RC to give it some temporal distance to allow for decay of inactivation. So the claim was that the extent to which we can observe principal A-like effects at the reflexive, it can't be because the comprehender had easy access to the matrix subject via recent activation. It couldn't have been since it's no longer recently activated. However, in doing so, we actually inadvertently created a configuration where the distractor could be enjoying a high level of activation. So inside the RC, the distractor has to be thematically integrated with the RC verb as well. So it could be that because there was thematic integration, you're retrieving the distractor along with its features. The distractor, it's enjoying a high levels of activation so that like when retrieval is launched at the reflexive, it becomes more accessible. And this could be why we're seeing interference effects. So claim 2 is testable, and I'll talk about what we're thinking of doing to test this in the next section when I talk about the experiments in the pipeline. So the main takeaway is that I think word order can influence how reflexives are processed. In English, we saw this in what seems to be principal A effects. So this is the reflex of the items being used, like it's immediately, the reflexives are immediately post-verbal. And in Tagalog, we saw this in what seems to be anti-principal A effects. So here's, some experiments that are in the pipeline. So right now we're in the process of collecting interpretation judgments to really see how robust the generalization that reflexives in Tagalog need to be locally bound. So we're going to use the same items in our SBR experiment. And instead of presenting it like self-paced reading style, we're just going to present it as an entire sentence. And this is going to be an untimed task. So we want to see if they're given all the time in the world, how are they interpreting these reflexives? And we are going to we included 2 ways to probe further interpretation of the reflexive, and I think they give us very different types of information. So in half of them, we have the same type of comprehension question that we use in our reading study. So sino ang pinupuri, who's being praised, and then you're presented with, well, the target or the distractor. So this gives us, this type of probe gives us a measure of their preference, like which noun do they prefer to function as the antecedent for the reflexive. In half of our items, we also have like a true-false judgment evaluation. So half of the time, the matrix subject will be clefted with the matrix verb, and then half of the time it's going to be the distractor that's clefted with the matrix verb. So I think this second type can actually give us a measure of what they allow in reflexive dependencies. So again, we're currently collecting data right now. So we're also thinking of running an experiment to see how tenable claim 2 was, that the interference effects that we observed in our reading study, that it's a reflex of Tagalog's word order. So consider 14 again. Recall that the distractor could be activated because of being thematically integrated with the RC verb. So at the reflexive, when retrieval is launched, the distractor could still be enjoying this high level of activation that makes it particularly accessible, which in turn could explain the interference effects that we've observed. So the way we're thinking of testing this claim is by leveraging the fact that Tagalog allows for head initial and head final RCs. So in essence, what we're trying to do is actually recreate an English-like configuration where the target is the one that is recently activated because of thematic integration. And we see this in 14. So the logic behind this is that if it's about recent activation that underlies the interference effects, then we would expect that in a configuration like 14 prime, so this is the English-like configuration, the interference effects that we would see would be weaker or smaller, and really qualitatively more like what researchers have seen in English. So that is all the things that I have. So maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for that talk, Jed. Very interesting. We have around 15 minutes for talks. If you will, please use either the raise hand function in the Zoom interface, which is under the reactions button. Or if you prefer, you can also post your question in the chat function, and I will read it out for you. Just as a reminder, if you prefer, you can also indicate whether or not you're a student. And if we don't have enough time for all of the questions, you can also head over to the Slack channel. There's some slight details about joining the different Slack channel. There's one Slack channel for each talk. There's some slight details about how to add yourself to each channel. So we'll post instructions in the general channel of the Slack. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or post in the chat. I think you should be able to do that now. Yes.
Am I supposed to also go to Slack to check the questions, or can I do that after the fact?
Yeah, the Slack is intended for after the question period.
Okay.
Okay, I see a question from Nozomi Tanaka. Can you please,
Hi, Jed.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for a wonderful and important talk. I have a couple of questions, but I will stop at one and
Okay.
Let others answer questions as well. I was actually wondering about, I know the meat of your presentation is in the reading times, but wondering about the comprehension question results. And you said you're going to do an interpretation judgment experiment later. So you might be actually addressing this question, but I was actually surprised that they're both in match and mismatch condition, their selection of the target was only around 70%. And I wasn't sure if it was an expected results given that it's self-paced reading, or if you found that result surprising as well.
So is the surprise coming from like why is the accuracy low? Is that
like why isn't it not higher if you expect the Tagalog reflexive to be locally bound?
That's a very good question. And if anything, I actually think that their comprehension questions really reflect how interference prone they were, because in the remember that like in or after each item, there is a comprehension question that also did not that didn't target like the reflexive dependency. So their accuracy is actually quite high. It was 85 to 97%. You know, like that's the range for like the non-reflexive dependency. So if anything, like again, these numbers really, oops, JK, where is it? Wait. There. If anything, these numbers really show that, you know, even in their like ultimate interpretation, that they're getting distracted by the distractor. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. We have a question from Sandy Chung. I'll read it out loud. I believe that Tagalog also permits V first, but subject final word order. Assuming this is the case, what might you expect to find if the reflexive precedes the target and the distractor?
So that is a very good question. So if the reflexive were to precede the target, then it would not be really like a backwards search, but rather they're going to be engaging in more like active dependency formation. So what would I expect? That there's probably not going to be interference effects, because then you would see the head noun first of the RC, which is the subject, right? So you don't like you can satisfy the dependency upon seeing the head noun, because then the distractor would actually be further downstream.
But what if the relative clause preceded the head?
Oh, I see. Oh, so like a head final RC, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That is, I do think that is something that we're actually thinking of running. So TBD, Sandy, and I'll get back to you on that. So.
Thank you.
Mhm.
If no one else has a question, maybe Nozomi can ask. Oh, I see that Matt Wagers has raised his hand. So go ahead.
Oh, well, I think we should hear Nozomi's other questions too. Jed, I was just wondering about, thank you for the talk. Could you talk about your motivations for how you picked the voice of the verbs? Because one thing that jumps out when you look at the way you design your materials is that the two clauses are really similar, the relative clause and the containing clause. And I'm wondering if the relative clause were more dissimilar along some dimension, for example, if it, you know, was in a different
has
voice.
agent voice inside instead.
Would you expect to find something different, or do you think it's sheerly about the properties of the nominal expression? So is this about the arguments or about the clause, perhaps?
So that's a very good question. So that's actually also one of the experiments in the pipeline, but I had to pick and choose what I could include in the slides. So yes, our one of our subsequent experiments will actually manipulate the voice inside the RC, because as you said, right, like right now they're both patient voice, and it could be that they're too similar that's why you're getting confused with you know. So to give it its best possible chance, yes, I think like a manipulation, like a voice manipulation inside the RC would, and compare that to you know, like when there's PV and AV inside the RC, then that could be like a manipulation that could be done. And it might be that in that case, when you have AV under the RC, then that it might be the cues, they're not overlapping too much, so then you might get like, more principal A-like effects. So that would be like a prediction of, if we were to run this study. I think that answered your question. Question mark?
Okay, Nozomi, do you want to ask your other questions?
Yeah, I feel bad to dominate the floor, but one of the other questions was just asked by Matt. So I have a more low-level, surface-level question about your choice of reflexives. You said in the beginning there are a couple of different forms Tagalog can use. Was there a particular reason why you chose the dative, like the more complex form of reflexives to use in your study experiment?
So as opposed to just the bare one, is that like, so what
Like
what is the point of comparison?
Like the
So
genitive
the one with the genitive. So no, so that one was really just a coin toss, coin toss, not a coin toss. Yeah. So no, there was like, that was just arbitrarily decided. I haven't done any like systematic, I didn't ask people like systematically like if they had different binding possibilities, but I believe they don't. I believe they have the same binding possibilities. So yeah, that one was just like arbitrarily decided. The fact that like we used the dative ones instead of the genitive ones. Although it would be interesting to do like the bare one where there's like no number feature that comprehenders could rely on. So and see what that, what the intrusion profile would be like if they had fewer cues to rely on for retrieval.
Yeah, I was also wondering what the mismo does. I know it's a loan word version of it, but and I don't expect any difference in the behavior. But yeah.
I guess I just had a clarifying follow-up question. So all of the items, for all of the items, it was the case that you used the dative form of the reflexive?
Yeah. And then the reflexive was presented as a whole. It wasn't like one word at a time. So yeah. So they saw ang kanyang sarili, like the entire thing, or ang kanilang mga sarili.
We still have around 4 minutes for questions. Anyone wants to have anything they're very curious about?
Sharing. We could also end early,
Yes,
a longer break is always much appreciated.
I was about to say yes. Okay, so in that case, if there are no further questions, we can have a slightly longer break, and we will reconvene at I guess 9:30, or I guess that is 16 minutes from now. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this talk. Hope to see you later on.